I took your ideas and made them into game-ready 3D models that could be used for animations, renders, and of course video games. So quickly for context, I asked for ideas, got a bunch of submissions, some with just text, others with drawings, and I ended up drawing them. Then I let you guys vote on some of your favorites, and I took some of my favorites and made them into 3D models. This video covers 3 of these, all with timestamps below, and a 4th drawing character that I didn't include in some of the previous videos. To start, we have Grieving Longlegs, an enemy design that didn't have a drawing but a description. So I took the information and turned it into a drawing that ended up looking like this. A big spider-like enemy in a graveyard. For obvious reasons, we're going to use this as the base reference for the 3D model. There's a simple process I follow for making characters, or really anything that I make in 3D. Step 1, a low poly blockout. Step 2, a high poly sculpt. Step 3 is retopology. Step 4, UV unwrapping and normals baking. Step 5, texturing and additional elements. Step 6, rigging. And finally, Step 7, animating. I guess there is a Step 8, which is like exporting it into the software you want to use, like Unreal. This is a simplification, and you don't need to follow this exact order every single time. In fact, you can skip certain portions depending on what your needs are, but for the most part, that's the process we'll be following. So, for the low poly blockout, I started by importing a picture of Grieving Longlegs and prepared the default cube in Blender. We just get the cube and we cut it in half and then add the mirror modifier to make it so that I only have to work on one side and then the other side is just done automatically, which just saves so much time when you're making symmetrical characters or objects. Essentially, the goal of working here is to copy the shape as closely as you can while remaining as low poly as possible. The reason for this is the more polygons and vertices you have, the harder it is to make big shape changes easily. It also increases file size and affects performance if you go into the really high poly counts. Normally you would want an isometric view opposed to an angled view like the drawing that I made. We can still make this work despite its issues. Like here you can see part of the bell with the runes is angled in the drawing, but I kept it as a straight line because if we were to follow it, we'd get some very big changes to the shape later on. After a short while, we ended up having something that looks like a bell, albeit very polygonal and sharp. A simple solution is to shade smooth the object and then mark sharp edges as sharp to preserve certain shapes and corners. Making the legs follows the same process, only here I copied the exact shape of the drawing a lot closer, to make the sculpting process a lot easier in the future. Now, to be completely honest, you could just directly start with sculpting and skip step 1 entirely, but I just prefer to front load the work a bit into the low poly to make sculpting easier. One of the more complicated parts, or rather the most complex part of making this model, was creating the feet holes that would allow the red gas or gloom to be emitted. But from here, about 80% of Grieving Longlegs is complete, and now it was time to just refine a lot of the shapes. So making sure that I'm applying shade smooth to everything, and changing some of the general proportions like elongating the bell because it looks a little bit too stubby at this point. From here I make a copy of everything I've made so far, and convert it into high poly for sculpting. The reason you need high poly for sculpting is you get more polygons to shape, allowing you to make more intricate shapes like the rune carvings on the bell. Before I start sculpting though, I had to fix a lot of the brushes that broke when I upgraded from Blender 3.4 to 4.4. And for those that want to know, sculpting brushes are kind of like Photoshop brushes that can greatly help you create and add detail a lot easier than manually doing everything. This normally doesn't happen, but I also had to get the normals flipped on the model just because of the way I made the actual mesh. Once that was done, it was time to sculpt the detail. Just like with the low poly earlier, it's most important to get the major shapes down first and then refine everything. Once you get those shapes down, it was time to add a bit of stone or metalish texture to the bell. You can add a lot of texture during the texturing process, but doing some of that work now makes texturing easier. And what I mean by this is I could basically just sculpt in metal detail, and then for the texture work I could just make it blue and it would work. Or if I wasn't very good at sculpting, I could make a metal texture and just throw that on there. It just depends on what you're good at. It was time to make some runes, but as I began you could see it looks kind of bad. And the reason is simple. I was working in too low poly, meaning I needed to increase this in order to get more nicer clean shapes. So I bumped up the count from 800k to 3.2 million. It's always easy to increase the poly count, so it's good to work low and then work your way up as required. Just for reference, the poly count we made at the beginning was 2 megabytes, but this sculpt is currently over 600. To put that in perspective, a game like Pikmin 4, if it had over 150 characters at 600 megabytes, it would end up being over 100 gigabytes. And that's just the character files. You know, no textures, no environments, no audio or code, which is all required in a game. But Pikmin 4 is actually only about 10 gigabytes. So how do we get this sculpt that I have a bunch of detail and then make it smaller? Well, I'll explain that in a bit. First, I went around adding the runes and little scratches and other cracks into the bell. They don't really have any significance, like the actual design of the runes. I just made some cool shapes. The rest of the bell sculpting was just making sure that we had sharp edges around all of the runes and that everything was looking a little bit more proper with detail. With the main body complete, it was time to move on to the other pieces. The legs were a lot easier to sculpt simply because I just needed to make them look like old bones, which can be done with brushes. And with that, the sculpt was done, and it was time to move on to retopology. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically the goal here is to copy the shape of the sculpt with as few polygons as possible. The goal, to reduce file size and improve performance. Thankfully, the low poly version I made earlier could be repurposed for a lot of this. However, there are some times where you have to retopologize from scratch. For the most part, this was pretty easy and barely anything had to change, but with the retopo done, it was time to UV unwrap, which takes the 3D shape of an object and projects it onto a 2D image. UV unwrapping, in short, is strategically marking seams on your 3D models, which are kind of like borders to separate each part. So for an example, I could just explain it with my hand. We're basically taking, if my hand was a 3D model, we're marking like a face on here, putting it on a piece of paper. Then we're taking this back part, putting it on a piece of paper beside that. And then we're going to do that for every single portion until we have the entire hand mapped out on like a piece of paper. Obviously you can have different objects. So like, let's say this pen, you could mark a seam down the middle, and then kind of like a paper towel roll, you could open it out, put it on a piece of paper, and then that's how you could get all the texture and detail from a 3D object onto a 2D texture map. The UV unwrapping is just setting up your models in order to be able to texture them. Obviously that's what we're going to try and do here, and then once we're done, we get something like this. The goal of when you're trying to UV unwrap is to give the most important or largest parts the most amount of space on the map, so they can get the maximum amount of the texture. If this is, for example, a 4K texture, one of these strips on the rune bells gets like a full 1080p image, but some of the smaller parts get like 240p of image space. With all of that done, it's time to bake normals. Now, normals also need the texture map, which is why we UV unwrapped first. Normal mapping is basically taking the high poly and putting the detail onto the retopo, so you get the benefits without the huge file sizes. Now, I actually ended up messing up here and baking the normals in color space. You always want to bake your normals in non-color space. Baking them in color space creates some ugly seams, which I do fix later, but it also creates some problems when you're texturing in other software. You can also only bake one object onto another, and since our boy is made out of a bunch of pieces, I had to bake separate normals and then merge them all together and fix any issues that showed up. Now, the issues are the green parts you see here. For merging, I just use Clip Studio Paint, but you could use Photoshop, GIMP, Krita, or any other alternative. And with the normal setup, we can finally delete the sculpt from the main file and keep a backup just in case. I also want to just do a quick flip so you can see that there's actually a very minimal difference between the high poly and the newer low poly one. But the sculpt file is 605 megabytes and the new one is 4. So now we take the model and export it into a texturing software. Blender also works for texturing, it's actually really solid. I just have more assets in Quixel Mixer and 3D Coat, so I tend to use those, but you can use your personal preference. Texturing is really easy once you have smart materials. You can download a lot of them for free, or you can make them yourself. What I did was take a very simple stony kind of bone looking like texture and just applied that to everything. This worked perfectly on the legs, but the bells needed a bit more. I added a metal texture for that part, but I needed to make it a little bit more rough, and I changed the dirt to be more green and moss or grime-like. Once I was happy with the results, I exported the 4 texture maps. Generally, you have an albedo or color texture, a roughness, a metalness, and of course, a normal map. There are more texture maps, but most models won't need them, and you just need those 4 core ones. However, in my case, Grieving does need a 5th one, being the emission map. Gotta make those runes glow after all. So after plugging everything into our material, Grieving was finally starting to look like the drawing, but in 3D. For the emission map, I just took a brush and drew directly on the model where I wanted it to glow. I just made it white in order to be able to easily swap the color in the future. Here is where you take some nodes and you can set the color to blue, red, green, or anything else. And from there, I tried fixing some of those ugly seams I mentioned earlier, but wasn't able to because I baked it wrong. So I temporarily accepted defeat and began rigging the character. This is straightforward. Your goal is to basically make a skeleton for the character. Then these bones have influence over specific vertices and faces or specific parts of the model, so that when you move a specific bone, the model moves with it. This is helpful because it means you don't have to create a new 3D model in a different position for every single action you want to animate. So what you do is then you parent the model to the rig, and then you have to weight paint it in order to get everything to function as you would want to. As you can see, I do red for everything a bone has control over, and blue means no control at all. Other shades like green are 50%, which help bends look a little bit more smooth when animating. With that done, I added some colors to the bone groups, and did a bit of pose testing to make sure the model works how I want it to and how an animator would expect. With that, it's portal time. Portal time just involves me taking a line, adding some nodes, and moving their values over time to create a spinning effect. Other elements like noise can be added to make it look a bit better, and then I just copied the red color from the emission we made earlier. The only problem with this is I'm 99% certain it'll break outside of Blender, so if you want to use this in Unreal or another engine, you'll have to make sure to make a portal from scratch there. I eventually fixed the normals by rebaking them, and you can tell by the color difference before and after. Before they were pretty pale, and then the ones I placed on top after fixing them are a lot more vibrant. The benefit of proper normals is of course you no longer have these ugly seams. Now we have the collector of Pikmin souls, Grieving Longlegs, fully complete. If you want to know more about this guy's mechanics and the original drawing, you can check out the video, link is in the description and it has timestamps. For our second character, we have Bushy Mireclops. Now this time I'm not going to go as in detail for explaining each part, since I kind of did that to make sure you have, the base knowledge with Grieving. The difference with this model is it actually came with a drawing submission. Just like before, we brought that image into Blender and used it as reference to start the low poly shape block out. Now this character is supposed to have another leg behind him, as they mentioned in the post, but we'll worry about that afterwards. This character is actually a lot easier shape-wise, but I had to take some liberty in deciding how thick or thin certain parts were going to be, because for the most part this image seems to be a mix between a Longlegs and a Mireclops. After shade smoothing everything, it was time to make a copy and start the sculpt. Thing is, with this guy we kinda don't need a sculpt at all. I just tried to make the bushy parts look more bush-like, and then the bone portions look a bit more rough and pointy. And with that, it was time to start the retopo. This was incredibly quick, as I just had to make some minor adjustments to the low poly version we made and more accurately follow the shape. Then it was time to prepare the model for UV mapping, and I started making additional objects that would end up sharing the same texture map, like the mushroom on this guy's feet. I also decided to make a really rough grass texture to test out some particle systems I'd have to put in place in order to make the model look better in the future. Particle systems are pretty handy, but their biggest problem is they can greatly increase poly count. For reference, most Pikmin enemies range between 7k and 15k poly counts, with some of the higher enemies being at 20k. So that was our benchmark for all the characters we were making. The Switch 2 is a lot more powerful, so I imagine a lot of the enemies that come out whenever Pikmin 5 is released could average a lot higher, but for now I just wanted to follow suit with the enemies from Pikmin 4. Back over to the particle system, once I got the rotation set up for the grass, it was time to assign some vertex groups. Now remember the red and blue weight painting from earlier? It's basically the same thing here, only you're assigning parts of the model where the grass can spawn. With that complete, it was time to set up the base for the vines. 3D modeling the vines would take way too much time, so I ended up using some geometry nodes which allow you to make procedural vines. In short, geometry nodes is like programming what you want Blender to make. You can set up how dense it'll be, you can add some particle systems just like I did with the grass. So what I'm going to do is make a basic leaf shape, make it a bit random so we can see how it'll kind of end up looking, And then I need to make a leaf texture. For this, you can download free images online, or you can take pictures in real life. This was a picture I had taken. Unfortunately, it's not like head on, so it's not really usable as a texture. However, I wanted to draw this anyways, so I opened up Clip Studio and I just copied the rough shape and color sampled the leaf as I drew it in order to make it as similar as possible. Once it was finished, we move over to Blender and I could set it as the objects for the leaves, so now the vine has some purple leaves. Then using the draw curve, I would set the vines as reference and start making procedural vines. Which, I'm guessing now you can see how this is much faster than taking a cylinder and manually making each vine, since here I'm literally just drawing in 3D, and then I have to tweak a little bit of the shape, and we have it complete. Now it was time to make a couple of the wind chimes, or one, and then I'll duplicate that for the others, and creating another plant texture based on an image I took in real life. This one was actually good enough to use as a photo scan, but it wouldn't make much sense to have one drawn and one like actual picture, so I decided to, actually draw the flower petal from scratch. Once that was done, I took the flower petals and made a full-on flower and then made a red variant. Mainly since I plan on having the red ones have his actual eyes and the purple ones just being regular flowers. And with that, the last piece was making the branch arms. Branch arms were pretty similar, just follow the shape and then get them going. With those complete, everything that needs a UV map has been made, and I can duplicate the objects in the future when required. Now, for UV editing, I could take all of the materials that I've made so far and put them on a single texture, and then I could take advantage of alpha values, but I'm not too sure how Pikmin 4 handles transparency textures, so I decided to just have a UV map with all of the solid colors, like from the main body, and then stuff like the flower, leaves, and I guess just the flower and leaves would be on their own separate image. With the UVs done, it was time to bake the sculpt. Not much detail here, but I made a sculpt, so might as well use it. Once that was done, I applied all the mirror modifiers and I placed the third leg at the back. With that finally done, it was time to texture it and test it out. So I applied a beady long legs type deal texture and it looked really scuffed, but we could tell it was working. We obviously don't want beady long legs 3.0, so I decided to take some materials that actually, look good, tweak their properties, made some masks so only certain part of the model would get affected. For this fellow, I actually ended up switching a lot between the 2D and 3D view in my texturing software, just to make sure I was applying certain materials to specific parts of the model. Once Bushy was in an acceptable state, it was back to Blender and setting up the materials. Then from there, I could take the other pieces like the vines and set up a couple UV maps for the textures I hadn't done before, like the little rock on his feet, his eyes, and fixing this awful grass texture that I hadn't yet. The plant textures were also looking kinda bad, so I went over to a free normal map generator online and then just basically uploaded the image that I had already drawn, and then it makes a normal map from that. So I did that for the leaves and the flowers to kinda add a little bit of depth to them. Then it was time to try and make Bushy Mireclops look more bush-like. So I made a leaf texture and then started preparing a particle system. But long story short, it didn't end up looking that good. The only way it started to look nice was by increasing the leaves in the particle system way too high. And running this fellow with that many leaves on the Switch would probably look like this. But I didn't want to have the leaves I just made, go to waste, so I took those and added them onto the main top eye. And with that, I reduced the polygon count a bit just to get it closer to that 15K sweet spot, and made sure that the eye was textured and all of the entire model was fully set up before I started the rig. The rig here is basically a more complex version of the Grieving long legs one I made, only with 3 legs. Then I had to add a couple of bones for the vines to allow people to animate or sway them, and then the rig was finally complete. For the most part, automatic weights worked really well, and I just had to tweak a couple of things here and there, again affecting the influence painting things red and other things blue. After that, it was just a couple of tests to make sure everything was functioning as intended, and boom, Bushy Mireclops was complete. For the third character in this video, we have the baby multicolored Spectralid. The mechanics for this fellow are the exact same as the adult version, only to a weaker extent. And now that I've mentioned the adult version, this is the perfect time for me to bring up that there are 4 other videos covering a bunch of drawings just like this. And if you check out my DeviantArt page, I have all of them visible and free for download, with links to the original video they're actually in, the original submission info, and more. If you happen to click on one of these art videos, you can actually check the timestamps and see exactly where each enemy is at. Also, if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing, liking, and giving likes or follows to the art page. Again, links for everything is in the description. It really does help me out. Back on track to the video, but before we get on to the fourth and final character, it is time to start making an environment. I decided to make a night skybox as that would be a good place to start. Basically, this was just taking a noise texture and a couple of other filters and then adding glow onto the material. For now, it's just a little bit of a night sky in this first 3D model video, but by the time we get around to the fourth video, it'll be a full environment, albeit a simple one. And now it's time for the Pianopede. This fellow ended up winning the entire art event. With that right, it gets an entire set of animations. I wanted to block out the Pianopede at the proper dimensions and scalings. Now, I hadn't mentioned this before, but when you're working on a project, you always want your objects to be relative to each other, and generally speaking, in real-world scale. But in the cases of small characters like Pikmin, this isn't always the case. Mainly because small characters can cause issues in game engines, because game engines are meant to have average size human characters. So when you're making really small things like ants and other bugs, it can get a bit glitchy. Or not so much glitchy, but at least hard to work with. So all of these enemies should be a couple centimeters tall or inches, but when I looked up BD Longlegs and other characters, they were actually about 100 times bigger than they should be, standing at like 3 meters or 10 feet tall. And so when I'm making these 3D models, I want them to be scaled similarly. This is so that when people throw these into a game engine, an animation, or the same Blender file, all of these enemies and assets will work with each other. It's a common mistake that beginners make where they have nothing scaling in the same size, so they'll throw in one enemy, he'll be really big, and then another one will be huge, and another one will be tiny. Again, we want all of them to be the same relative to each other, so it makes it easier for anybody else working with these. The blockout was pretty simple, and I prepared to make an array for the piano keys. I actually ended up making the Pianopede have the same amount of keys as an actual piano. This is so that for each bone, I could have an audio file attached to it. Now you'd have to do that in game engine, but it's for the future. Which means theoretically you could play a piano song when fighting this boss. One of the most annoying parts for setting up the Pianopede was actually adding a place for the eyes to go, but I eventually managed to get it. And with that, it was time to sculpt the detail like the segments between each of the legs. And with the sculpt done, I made a few tweaks to the retopo and began to UV unwrap. I made sure to place all the related parts together and then got ready to bake the normals. Texturing this guy actually took like 10 minutes, I basically speedran it, but it was essentially adding a texture that kind of made him look a little bit more rough and keeping the piano keys smooth. And with that, it was time to rig one of the most annoying animal types, long slinky boys. Thankfully, I had gone through this pain before when I made Quetzalcoatl. The reason one of these models is actually so difficult to rig or set up for animation is because of the way they actually move in real life. You want to be able to set them up for a striking pose where they stand up from the middle. Because if the rig just goes from the head and then the body moves, tweaking each of the part becomes essentially impossible since it should be moving from the base. But then at the same time, you also want it to be able to slither or crawl along the ground, which requires the rest of the body to follow the head movement. So this is why you need a rig that moves in both directions if you're planning on just doing a traditional rig. You could also just animate this with empties. Using empties allows you to make a track or curve and then the character can follow it, which is actually the easiest and quickest way to do this. The problem is they don't always work in engine and they are only for one specific movement. So every single time you want to do something else, you need to set up a different curve or track. Regardless, it was basically just reverse engineering the previous rig I had made, adding a couple things like the bones for all of the piano keys, and removing other parts that I did not need. After all that was done and I set up all of the main bones, it was time to weight paint and start testing the rig. Weight painting took some time, but little by little I did get it all set up. The deformation seemed acceptable, so it was time to start setting up the drivers and custom properties for the character to get this guy ready for the animation. This part is very boring since you have to set up each bone one by one, and there isn't a method of batch applying everything, especially the influence logic we're going to use to allow the rig to change directions. Then I hit a wall. Basically, the animation or setting up of the poses look like this. Not smooth at all, and it looks pretty bad. Now, this could be for two reasons. One, the polygon count is too low. Two, the rig is too limited in the amount of bones it has. It's most likely the former or first reason, so it took a couple of hours, but I tweaked the 3D model, fixed a couple of issues with the rig, and then I added the piano keys that I hadn't done before and made sure I applied the right amount of weights to them. It was finally time to animate. But before I got onto that, people also wanted to be able to download this 3D model. So you can, for free. For the animations, there were 4 of them that I wanted to do. A regular strike, kind of like a cobra, the rollout attack that was mentioned in the original submission, the curl and consume attack, also mentioned, and finally, a walk cycle. The strike is pretty simple. I wanted to make him go up, again kind of like a cobra, and then strike. The rollout one was built off of the first animation, only instead of lunging, he turns into a wheel of sorts, and then he can roll around the arena, crushing anything in his path. And from there we have the curl attack, where he goes and tries to eat the Pikmin on his back, curling, running his head along the piano keys, and then when the attack ends, he goes back into his default position. And finally, a simple walk cycle that loops indefinitely. And there's the first set of enemies complete in this 4-part series. Thanks for watching.